Welcome everyone to the Stearns Financial live chat. I'm Dennis Stearns, and today we are joined by Stearns Financial's Dax Dixson and Ryan Hodapp and Greg Stumm, who are both chartered financial analysts, CFAs, Dax's as well, I should mention. And they are good thinkers on the investment side, but they're also really good thinkers on the future trends. They read a lot, they network with some of the top people in the area. And so I've been assured that almost any question is fair game about the future. So that's a challenge to all of you out there in TV land or Zoom land. To come up with some good questions. But welcome, Ryan and Greg.
Thank you, and thank you for having us. Dennis, where would you like us to begin?
Well, so I think one thing that would be interesting to start out with is Morningstar's 9 future themes. And our clients are familiar with some of them because we've been talking about them relative to the convergence of some of the big super trends that are happening. And so just any commentary on each of these trends would be great.
Okay.
So let's start with the number 1 item there, big data and analytics.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dennis. And thank you all for joining today. We truly appreciate the time. Just for some context, both myself and Greg, we work for a firm called Resolute Managers. Greg heads up our national sales effort, and then I am an ARC product specialist, ARC Invest product specialist. ARC is a firm that we have a very strong relationship with, and it was founded by Kathy Wood. And for those of you who don't know Kathy Wood, she is an innovation enthusiast, and everything, therefore, that ARC does centers around identifying disruptive innovations, and that's where we sort of fit in. So what we thought we'd do today is kind of talk a little bit about Morningstar's themes and kind of where ARC may agree, disagree, maybe have some thoughts that are a little bit tangential. And then Greg and I are kind of going to have a little bit of a fireside chat and give you some more thoughts in terms of what ARC's thinking about in terms of the future. But if we look at big data and analytics, as I think about it from ARC's perspective, and we're probably going to talk about this in a couple of minutes, so this will be a little bit more of a tease. But what they are notably interested in is what's called deep learning, and basically what deep learning is it's complex artificial intelligence algorithms designed after the human brain. It's literally artificial intelligence that teaches itself. And what's so exciting about it is it's really cross-sector. AI, deep learning, it's going to impact everything from healthcare to technology to autonomous driving, and it's a really, really big opportunity. But I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. The networks and computer systems theme I see here on the page. There are a couple of things I think about in terms of where ARC's doing research in this space. You know, it's not necessarily the connectivity between hardware and software that you see here, but number one, it's more some of the what I'd call the hardware backbone. So if you think about these big data centers that are powering a lot of the cloud computing trends that you think about, cloud computing architecture. One of the things that ARC has noticed is when you think about the chips and the processors that power these big data centers, there is a rather large incumbent that is Intel that has something like 92% market share. And based on ARC's research, there are some emerging capabilities that are cheaper, faster, and more powerful. And we think they're going to usurp the big incumbent that is Intel. So that's number one. And then as I think about just connectivity in general, another area where ARC's doing a lot of research actually is in orbital aerospace of all things. Believe it or not, there are 3 billion people around the world and 40 some odd million in the US that still don't have broadband internet access. They couldn't be doing what we're doing here today. You know, maybe it's because they live in remote areas, what have you, but they don't have broadband. And one of the ways we think that we're going to solve that is by literally getting more satellites up in the sky. Rockets relative to, back in the 70s and 80s, are now actually reusable. They're more cost effective. And instead of just shooting up one rocket with one satellite, the satellites themselves are also smaller and more actually foldable, so that we can often fit like 36 satellites. So what we think is going to happen is we're eventually going to get a multitude of satellites up in the sky, sort of creating a constellation network, and that's going to solve some of those broadband issues, which should be good for the global economy at large. And then lastly, on this page, and then we can go on to the next ones, nanotechnology. I've not necessarily heard of ARC talk about nanotechnology, in the true kind of James Bond movie sense of the word. But as I think of nanotech, it's all things small. You see it on here, atoms and molecules. And there are a couple of things when I think about all things small that ARC's been thinking about, one of which is not investable yet, and one of which is. The one that's not investable yet is what's called quantum computing. So think about super computers that are extremely fast. And when you think about quantum mechanics, it's all about atomic and subatomic level. It's just not ready for prime time yet, and partially because I think it's a little bit cost prohibitive. And as you'll hear over time, one of the things that ARC really focuses on is falling costs, ultimately driving demand within innovations. But where there is what I'm going to call a nano technology that's very much ready for prime time, it would be tied to everything from DNA sequencing to gene editing, and something we may talk about as well. But if you think about it, that DNA, the genome, RNA, that's about as tiny as you can get, and that's an area we're certainly excited about. So
okay, well. And before we go to the next page, I'm sure that we've got a couple in the audience who might say, well, all those small satellites going up in space are a wonderful thing, except for the space junk problem that we seem to have. And let's see, was it China that actually kind of lost track of one of their satellites that came down not that long ago? Fortunately, not in a populated area. I don't know if you have any comments on.
So the thinking with these like mesh networks is they're going to be low orbit satellites, and they literally have built into the satellites, because even those are often are driven by our deep learning artificial intelligence. They literally have a built-in clock, most of them. And then what happens when they get to the end of the clock, they literally fall out of the sky. And it's not that there's space junk per se, but they will literally burn up in the Earth's atmosphere, and that's what they're designed to do, as opposed to just floating, right in our orbit. And all of a sudden we look up in the sky in 5 to 10 years, and all we see is a bunch of satellites floating around that aren't even working. We don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. Well, we do disposable everything else, right? So why not disposable satellites?
It's true.
All right, let's go on to the next page.
Sure.
Medicine neuroscience, that's a big one.
Yep. So the big word I see in here is the human genome, and so we are doing a lot of work in that particular space. And I see the word biomarkers on here. Well, what, I will go ahead and talk about this, because it is one of the areas I think I'm personally most excited about. So as we think about the healthcare industry today, it is all about treating the symptoms. Well, what if instead of just treating the symptoms, we could uncover those biomarkers at a much earlier stage, and then B, we could actually come up with some therapies that might actually be curative, actual cures. So if we look at the biomarker thing first, and more specifically, we actually have mutations on our genes. There are two ways we're looking to tackle that. First of all, we are big believers in what's called long-read DNA sequencing. It's exactly what it sounds like. So a longer read of the genome. By having a longer read, it just means we're going to have a more accurate read of whether or not we see those mutations. And here's where you're going to start to hear the recurring theme. One of the things that we think is going to drive this particular innovation is falling costs. So if you go back to 2003, when we had the advent of the original mapping of the human genome, it cost $2.7 billion. Fast forward to today, Greg was actually on a webinar with Kathy Wood. Kathy said that now it costs only around $500, and that is expected to go down to $100 to $200 here within the next 5 years. And the reason that's really important, once you get to that $100 to $200 range, A, it just makes it more cost effective for the average person, but B, I think it increases the likelihood that the insurance companies pick it up. So that's one way I think we're going to uncover those markers for disease. And then number two, multi-cancer screening, which is also kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a way to screen for 50 different types of cancers and do so in a fairly non-invasive way through something like a liquid biopsy. So literally a blood draw as opposed to an actual biopsy. This is another innovation that has everything to do with falling costs. I think the original prototype for this diagnostic, just like 6 years ago, was like $30,000. It's down to $1,500 today, and that's also going to go down to a couple $100 here in 5 years, which again increases the likelihood that the insurance companies are going to pick it up. Why? Well, if you think about cancer treatments, one of the most popular and well-known treatments for cancer is chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is very, very expensive. If the insurance companies can kind of help head that off and identify cancer in stage 1 as opposed to stage 3 and 4, they're going to be all for it. So that's what we mean by kind of uncovering those biomarkers using both long-read DNA sequencing and multi-cancer screening, and we may come back to this, but then it's what do you do with all that data, and then we start to think about things like gene editing. There's a capability called CRISPR-Cas9 where you literally snip the bad parts of the DNA out and write the ship. So there's all kinds of gene and cell therapies that we think are actually creating some real cures.
Yeah, and we've been sharing a lot of that information about the progression for CRISPR and how with all the other news that goes on, somehow some of that big news gets buried and people aren't even paying attention to some of these big trends coming along. Now, there is a frequently asked question from our clients around medicine and healthcare. Their perception is that the government drives it all.
Yep.
That now, what you talked about sounded like, there's an awful lot of parts of it that are just driven completely outside of what's going on in Washington. Sure.
Yeah, healthcare sector always has a political bullseye on it. Particularly when you head into to election season. Although it's interesting, right? Because particularly when, and this isn't making a political statement, but when there's a Democratic regime, that healthcare often has a little consternation around it, tied to ultimately bringing costs down. The interesting thing is I actually did an analysis in my last job on this, when those fears were running high, right? The last time it happened was when Bill Clinton was in office from 92 to 2000. And there were a lot of people concerned about what was called Hillary care at the time. Based on the analysis that I did during that same time period, some of the largest healthcare funds in the industry actually outperformed the broad market by something like 800 basis points or 8% per year, which seems very counterintuitive, right? When there's that biggest political bullseye, healthcare actually performed best. So I just want to, sometimes politics and what actually goes on in the investing world, there ends up being a big disconnect. But you do have to pay attention to it. I think it's a really good point, Dennis, right? Because there can be subtle regime changes. And I think what ultimately happens is, there's a lot of stuff promised on the campaign trail, and then what ultimately happens is a little less draconian. But what's at the heart of a lot of the budget proposals right now is, for example, bringing prices down, drug prices and all those kind of things. And I think the first two things that I mentioned, the multi-cancer screening and the DNA sequencing, they align with that theme because, as I mentioned, costs are coming down. Prices are coming down, and that is good. And I think that aligns with what the current regime is thinking. The one part of the one area where we're doing research where it is a little bit more costly, albeit if you amortize it over longer term, it's not as costly as you might think, would be things like gene therapy and gene editing. But to your point, Dennis, we think this is one area that may get around some of that consternation, just in that it's a truly noble cause because we are actually trying to come up with cures. So let me give you a real world example. There's a company called CRISPR Therapeutics that has developed some treatments for something called beta thalassemia. And what beta thalassemia is, it basically means you have low hemoglobin or low oxygen in your blood. Well, people who have beta thalassemia often have to have multiple blood transfusions per year, right? That's a pretty invasive process. Well, with one CRISPR-Cas9 treatment, which again, remember, this is your gene editing capability. I think there's one story I heard. There was one patient with one CRISPR dose had gone something like 22 months without a single blood transfusion. And so this is just really exciting science in general, because when you get to its heart, it's not only about saving lives. It's not only about extending lives. It's also about improving the quality of life, and that's lessening the blood transfusions and things of that nature. And I think that's something that the government would want to get behind. Greg, you have some comments?
Well, and
Dennis,
before you jump in there, Greg, I do need to mention to our audience that was not a stock recommendation.
Correct.
That was an example of something happening within the framework of this medicine and neuroscience. Greg, go ahead.
Thank you, Dennis. Yes, my series 24 was tingling there as well, knowing that we need to make those comments. But no, what I was going to say, Dennis, is when it comes to politics, especially within healthcare, but really everything with politics, it's really driven, about finances, right? Within healthcare, it's the cost of healthcare, who is covering that cost, and then the profits generated by companies providing those services in the healthcare industry. And most of regulation and political interaction that we're seeing in that space is around those three things and trying to manage those three things. And what Ryan mentioned earlier in one of his previous comments is one of the beauties of these technologies is they lower costs and they drive costs down. And that is a game changer, not only for healthcare and quality of life, but also, the amount we spend on healthcare. And how that impacts, the government's, impact on it as well. And so I think that those declining costs are going to be very powerful when it comes to political motivations around healthcare costs, healthcare as well.
Great, thanks, Greg.
Well, we had one of our clients is a healthcare expert and does a lot of national work, and on one of these chats made the comment that, at least in his opinion, that the majority of the future of healthcare in the next 10 years is not going to be driven by the government. It's going to be driven by a lot of the private companies and technologies and new things that you guys are talking about. So it'll be interesting to see that push and pull between the two forces.
Yep. Yeah, and there's a lot of businesses where that may be going on. I kind of briefly mentioned, suborbital aerospace, and I know there's a question. I'll get to that in a second on that. But if you think about, there's like a current space race going on, right, between a few billionaires. You got Elon Musk and Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, and that's another example, right? Who has been the de facto space organization? It's been NASA. And now it's going to the private sector, and people are spending money, and they're accelerating the timeline of why these innovations are going, which does speak to, so one of the questions in the chat is small satellites in low Earth orbits launched by reusable space vehicles. That's not a new thing. This tech goes back to the late 80s. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding what you're informing. If so, please clarify. What I was trying to say is, more times than not, if you go back to the 70s and 80s and a satellite needed to be launched, it would be one rocket with one satellite. They'd shoot it up, and it would more times than not be one and done. Now, using Elon Musk as an example, he's got a Falcon 9 rocket, I think, that's already been used at least 8 times. It's gone up and it's come back down and landed again. And the reason that's so important, it just saves a ton of money on the cost side, which allows you to just do more and more and kind of increase your capabilities, if that makes sense.
Well, and Ryan, again, this comes back to the declining costs, right? So
Yes.
So with that declining cost, enables us to put more satellites up there, to use that mesh network to deliver Wi-Fi to people, or broadband access that wouldn't have it, right? And so
Exactly right.
I think one of the really interesting things that hopefully people take away from this conversation is that these technologies are not going to focus on one specific area. They're really going to be applicable to dozens of different areas of our lives, and they're going to change a lot of different things because of that.
Yeah, so for context, a huge centerpiece of ARC's research is centered around something that's called Wright's Law. And what Wright's Law says is for every cumulative doubling in units produced, and we may actually talk about that once we get to energy and environmental systems, for every cumulative doubling in units produced, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, what you tend to see is a nice linear decline in costs over time. So that just tells you, and then as those costs decline, what tends to happen is you'll get a nice tipping point for demand and unit growth. So it's just kind of a proof point that everything that ARC is, well, not everything, but a huge portion of what ARC is looking at is where are those cost curves declining and how can they kind of drive strong growth into the future.
Yeah, well, and just had a client yesterday very worried about inflation and where that's going to go in the future. And you know, when I mentioned that there are deflationary forces out in the world, he said, well, where are they? I don't see them at my grocery store. And
Yep.
I think, you know, a lot of the things you're talking about are disinflationary or even just outright deflationary.
That's exactly right. You know, so energy environmental systems, you know, this is a great example. So we don't necessarily have a lot of direct investments in things like wind and solar, but we do have a couple investments in things that I think are sort of pushing this environmental agenda. Number one, far and away, would be our investments in electric vehicles. And what's driving the growth in that space has everything to do with falling costs, another deflationary trend. Far and away, one of the biggest costs of an electric vehicle is the battery. That's the biggest cost to manufacture an electric vehicle. And based on Wright's Law, electric vehicle batteries are falling at a rate of roughly 28%. And so based on ARC's research, as these costs continue to decline, what ARC thinks is going to happen is that electric vehicles are basically going to be at price parity with gas-powered vehicles in just a couple short years. And then they're going to get cheaper from there. And you're going to see this huge hockey stick in demand. So, and that, by the way, the sticker price is an interesting thing there. Right now, the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle, it's already cheaper than a gas-powered vehicle when you think about maintenance costs and all those things. But the average person doesn't care about total cost of ownership. When they actually spend their money, it's usually the sticker price that makes the difference. So a couple years out, we're going to be price parity, then we get cheaper. And to give you a sense for what that hockey stick could look like, you know, we're coming off a low base, to be sure. There's only like 2.2 million EVs on the market today, but they think that can grow to 40 million by 2025. That is an 82% compound annual growth rate. And the interesting thing is we're already starting to see it, I think. And again, any stock we talk about is not a recommendation to go out and buy it. These are just giving you some examples. But if you look at a company like Tesla, for example, I think they recently announced that just their China sales alone were recently up something like 51%, and auto sales in general are down 17%. But it's a long-winded way of saying, you know, electric vehicles are certainly more eco-friendly than their gas-powered counterparts, and we think that's kind of where the hockey puck's going. The second part may surprise a few people, and that would be things like cryptocurrency. You hear a lot of rhetoric around how, you know, crypto mining is sucking up a bunch of power and all these kind of things, right? But what a lot of people don't realize is that I think something like 3/4 of crypto mining is done using renewable resources. And so in a very perverse way, cryptocurrencies and crypto mining is shining a light on renewable resources in a way we really haven't in a long time. Just for a couple real world examples, I think it was a couple months ago, there was a company in Texas that basically said they were going to set up a new mining facility and they were going to power it with 100% solar power. And then the big story here over the past few months, El Salvador recently announced that they are going to accept Bitcoin as currency. And in terms of doing any sort of mining, they are going to power it with geothermal energy. So literally volcanoes. So it's a couple examples, but it's actually starting to foster new investment in these environmental systems that I think a lot of people aren't necessarily looking at right now.
Well, so question that comes up here often, Ryan, is in the crypto area, apart from comments like the one this last week from Jamie Dimon that was not very flattering, but the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, has made some comments about the U.S. working on a digital currency, and so some people are wondering, well, all right, if we have a officially backed U.S. digital currency, what does that do to crypto? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there's a very real scenario, whether it's us, whether it's China or both. I'm just thinking a couple of the largest countries on the planet, largest economies. It is a very real possibility that we have some form of a digital currency, which, as I think about it, ultimately is just another way to enable digital transactions and things of that nature. But what's completely missed upon that particular rhetoric is a government-sponsored digital currency gets away from one of the primary aspects of cryptocurrency, in that cryptocurrency is decentralized. There is no government, there is no government impact, there is no central force that can, for example, print money, right, and create inflationary forces, all those kind of things. Cryptocurrency is completely decentralized. It's completely, you can do cross-border transactions with no issue. The more and more I've personally thought about it, but what's really interesting to me about crypto and Bitcoin, it's more of an emerging markets story than I think a lot of people would realize. And El Salvador is a great case study for that. There are a lot of people from El Salvador that will come to the US, they will work here, and then they will send money back to their families. Well, they have to, in order to do so, they'll often use what's it called, Western Union, and Western Union may charge them 10, 20%. And then there may also be a several day delay in terms of when the funds actually even reach their family. Well, with something like Bitcoin, it may only cost them 1% or 2%, and they can get the money there within a couple hours. And so as I just think about the cross-border capabilities, that's something that just a pure US, for example, digital currency, it's not really going to be able to solve for.
Okay. Well, so anything else in the energy and environmental before we move on to robotics?
No, EVs and crypto, I think, would be the two big there. So we can talk about robotics if you'd like.
Okay. Well, that is something that we have a number of clients, business clients, who are definitely leaning into that trend. Tell us your thoughts about it.
Yeah, this is an area we're certainly excited about. And, to give you kind of the short version of the story, we think that, when robotics and when automation is deployed, not only is it beneficial to the companies that deploy it, it's also beneficial to their end employees. And that's the part that's often missed, because a lot of times people think that when robotics are deployed, oh my gosh, a whole bunch of people are going to lose their jobs. And in reality, it's often the exact opposite. Why? Well, often what happens is when companies deploy robotics, when they deploy automation, they end up being more profitable. They have more cash flow, higher margins, greater productivity. And because of this greater level of profitability, what they're able to do is actually retrain their employees for better, higher paying jobs. And so, again, to give you a real world example, Amazon, I think it was this year, they said they're going to retrain 100,000 employees. And who knows what those jobs ultimately look like, but you could ultimately have someone managing a fleet of robots, or you could have, someone doing the maintenance on the robot and anything and everything in between. But we do think this is ultimately going to be net positive for the employees. Also, this is another area where clearly costs are coming down. If you think of the big industrial robots that you would see in like an auto manufacturing building, I think back in the mid 90s, those things cost like 150 grand. That's since come down to $20,000 to $25,000. So costs are continuing to come down in the industrial robot space. And then the area we're kind of also interested in is it's basically what's called Cobots, or collaborative robots, basically robots that work alongside of humans. And if you think about the Amazon example, it's a great example, right? You're going to have a robot arm at Amazon that, by the way, is powered by deep learning artificial intelligence, getting better and better at putting things in a box. and there are going to be humans that are going to be working alongside of that. Or if you want a really fun, silly example, and go look this up on YouTube, it's fun. There is a robot called Flippy. And Flippy's whole reason for being is to basically make the perfect hamburger. And so there's literally this robot that will flip the hamburgers to perfection, put it on the bun, and they can work alongside of a line chef. The more and more you think about it, it's all about kind of productivity and enhancements, which are sort of profitability positive, if that makes sense.
So I know McDonald's has been working on the robot that would be at the drive-through window, which based on my last few experiences would be a great upgrade, I think. Any idea when those kinds of things are going to be coming along?
I don't know the exact timeline, but I would say within the next 5 or so years that's quite possible, because if you see something like Flippy, 5 to 10, somewhere in that nature, you don't have to worry about Flippy communicating. But you know, so now we're going to come back to deep learning again, right? Because you're going to need some artificial intelligence, because that particular robot is going to have to communicate. One of the things that's been evolving in the artificial intelligence space is, if you go back probably 5 or 6 years ago, the AI as we know it, it was very, what I call vision-based, meaning artificial intelligence could recognize pictures. And what's evolved as the computing power has gotten stronger, and more importantly, here we go again, the costs have come down. Earlier this week, Kathy said artificial intelligence training costs, i.e. the cost to train the AI model, they're falling at like 68% per year. Well, as the computers have gotten more powerful, the costs have come down. These AI models are developing into more language-based models, which kind of speaks to what we're talking about here. So you've got the robot that's eventually going to have to speak to some extent, and I'm sure they're going to have some sort of program script. But to give you another real-world example where that could help and improve productivity, imagine if you're a paralegal and you have this lengthy legal document that you have to analyze. There's an AI capability called GPT-3 that could take that entire document and look at it and consolidate to one paragraph and tell you, here's what you need to know. Imagine that from the paralegal's perspective. It just would be a huge time saver. They can go on and do bigger and better things. And so these language capabilities are really, really exciting. And one more fun story. So with GPT-3, I read a story not too long ago. Someone gave GPT-3 3 inputs. It was a title, the name of an author, and the word "it," just to get things going. And with just those 3 inputs, the AI model literally came up with a 5-paragraph story in the voice of that author, like that. So it just speaks to how powerful this computing power is in the artificial intelligence space.
So Ryan, that's fascinating stuff. I want to circle back to robotics real quick. I think Dennis touched a little bit on inflation, and there's certainly forces right now that are immediately inflationary. But as you look over the long term, in many economies throughout the globe, you're seeing declining populations, especially in some places where we've seen cheap labor, i.e. China, not to mention that some of the decoupling with the Western nations with China right now. So what I wanted to ask is, over the intermediate to longer term, does the research that they're doing at ARC indicate how robotics can maybe replace some of those cheap sources of labor and maybe tamp down inflation over the long term?
Yes, and the McDonald's examples is a good one, because could you see some job losses in an instance like that? To some extent, maybe. But what happens, since time immemorial, those very same people that might have had that job, what ends up happening is they get higher, better paying jobs. So yeah, to answer your point, the deflationary part's definitely there, partially because A, the cost of the robots is coming down, but B, you're going to be able to almost have your fixed cost, right? It would be your salary, right? What would normally be a salary or a wage, you're going to kind of quasi be able to flatline that. You don't have to give a robot a wage. So there's sort of the deflationary on top of the lowering cost of the robot. But again, the other people that could lose their jobs, they will go out and find better, higher paying jobs. the other example I always like to give, because it is, people are really concerned about this whole robotics are going to take jobs. Anytime a new technology comes, it's going to take jobs. Remember the advent of the internet? People thought that alone was going to just destroy tons and tons of jobs. And instead, it created a whole bunch of jobs that we could not have even imagined before. There are also, productivity enhancements. So robotics are being, and artificial intelligence are being used in farming. So now you're eventually going to see a farmer that's going to be able to have a robotic, autonomous combine. And what that just means is the farmer themselves isn't going to have to sit there behind the wheel. They're going to be able to go do something more productive, something that could actually create economic activity. We are eventually going to see autonomous vehicles and autonomous ride-hailing services. Our cars sit in our garage 23 hours per day. Imagine if we could lend our car out as an autonomous taxi service or something along those lines. That could create economic activity. Or we spend 1 or 2 hours in our day commuting. Imagine if you're in a major city and you could use an autonomous taxi and be productive because you don't have to sit there and look. So there are all kinds of things where these worlds are basically converging, right? So it's robotics, it's artificial intelligence. It's going to be good for the economy, and I think it's going to be deflationary when we add it all up.
Yeah, do you see that being a force to maybe reshore some manufacturing that's gone overseas over the past 20, 30 years?
Yeah, I think so. Some of that will hinge on how much of the innovation in the robotic space is here in the U.S., but I think it is. We are a very innovative nation. So it's not to say that in innovative countries like China and Israel and Korea, you won't see some of that over there as well. But yeah, I think we could see some insourcing of that as well. Okay.
All right. Let's move on to the next slide.
3D printing.
3D printing.
All right. Yeah, this is one. We definitely believe in longer term. It is an innovation I would tell you is a little bit more in the nascent stage. We're still in the early stage because as you think about 3D printing as it stands today, it's mostly used for things like prototyping, for example. But we think there are a whole host of what we call end use cases longer term that are really going to probably drive some notably strong growth. One example would be the aerospace industry. Imagine if you're an aerospace manufacturer and you could manufacture, well, first of all, you're looking to save costs, right? Here we go. So here's the deflationary thing again. What if you want to save costs? Well, you could create some low volume, very complex parts to put inside of your planes or your jets using 3D printing. And here's the deflationary ripple effect. Not only does that help save the aerospace manufacturer money, it's also going to save the airlines money because that material is lighter, which means the planes themselves are also going to be more fuel efficient. So it's a nice deflationary ripple effect. But there are a whole host of end uses and everything from aerospace to healthcare that we think are pretty exciting here. While I did say it's in the nascent stage, during COVID, 3D did have a little bit of a coming out party because you've seen all these shortages and the manufacturing issues out there, and 3D printing has helped a little bit. It's not to say that we don't still have some clogs in the system right now, but there were things like masks and ventilators and all those kind of things where 3D printing did at least help ease some of the demand burden.
Well, and we have shared with our clients in the past the 4 technology stages, the initial frenzy stage where everybody's excited, but it's sort of ahead of its time, followed by the consolidation phase, which is also sometimes a nice word for a bust.
Yeah.
And then the third phase, the deployment phase, is where really powerful stuff happens. And then ultimately, but it can be decades, the maturity stage. So a lot of the things we're talking about, including 3D printing, we went through some frenzy stage 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and kind of moving into a different deployment stage, and particularly how these things work together, that convergence piece you talked about.
Yep. Yeah, and the other thing you mentioned, there's that, that, well, I guess I used the term kind of coming out party. The other interesting thing, COVID's been a horrible, horrible situation, but in the innovation space, it really pulled a lot of demand forward in the innovation space. So 3D printing would be one example. Digital wallets, which, I guess I'll partially jump to the financial services. Actually, I'll come back to that, financial services innovation.
Okay.
And then just video gaming of all things, right? Video gaming was already growing, but the growth of video gaming just went hyperbolic because we were all locked in our homes and looking for things to do. Now, what's come out of the backside of that particular trend is, particularly for the younger set, video gaming has now become a social hangout. My son, often 2 floors above me, he's got a computer screen in front of him where he's playing one game. They got the headset on, talking to their friends. He's got a second screen where his friend is streaming a completely different game, and they're on a Discord chat server on their phone all at the same time. This is how the kids hang out, and that's just going to increase the in-game spend. But it's just like three completely different industries, right? 3D printing, digital wallets, which we'll talk about in a second, and video gaming, 3 different industries. But COVID really pulled forward a lot of the demand and accelerated the growth in those particular innovations.
Okay. So you want to talk about the science of collecting and analyzing complex biological data?
For sure. And I think we already talked about that. So, there's a couple of different ways to look at bioinformatics. One would be, the Fitbit, watch that I have on my wrist as we speak today, and the Apple Watches and stuff like that. That is important, but that's not necessarily where ARC is invested. As ARC looks at the word bioinformatics, they're thinking about things such as DNA data, and then what do you do with that particular data? So that does get back to long read sequencing, as well as the various cell and gene therapies. So maybe since I haven't talked about it, let me give you another example of one of the exciting cell and gene therapies where you have to take DNA data and all the little tiny stuff in your body and do something with it. There's something called CAR T cell therapy. And here's what that is. So basically we have these T cells in our body. They're immunocells, and they have these receptors, and these receptors basically attach to the bad proteins in our body and eradicate them. Well, sometimes these T cells don't have the right receptors to attach onto specific cancers in particular. And so what CAR T does is it takes those T cells out of your body, it re-engineers them in a lab, it grows them in a lab, and then puts them back in your body to target very specific cancers. What's exciting about that particular innovation is, you remembered earlier I talked about chemotherapy, right? That's one of the primary ways to treat cancer. Well, one of the unfortunate things about chemotherapy is not only does chemo kill the bad cells, it also kills the good cells, which is why it's such an invasive process. What if we could come up with an innovation that actually just goes after the bad cells? And that's sort of the thinking behind CAR T. Now, there's one big caveat to that particular innovation. Right now, CAR T is only approved for liquid tumors, and liquid tumors only make up something like 12% of cancers. The remaining 88% are solid tumors. ARC thinks that will eventually kind of come to fruition in about 5 years or so. So I just wanted to give you another example, because we talked about CRISPR-Cas9, we talked about DNA sequencing, but a lot of this has to do with, ultimately, you have DNA data, you have computing power, because artificial intelligence is going to come in and analyze and all that kind of stuff. And then it's ultimately kind of what you do with that data.
Okay, well, and I know we want to leave some time here for the things that you think are bad ideas for the future. Sure. in a world of disruption. So anything else on financial services or fintech or anything in that?
Well, I have a quick question, if I may, Ryan. Yeah. So throughout so far you've talked about one key to innovation is declining costs on different platforms. One thing that's kind of come about during the pandemic is it sort of fits into this last theme. It's non-fungible tokens, which seems to run counter to the declining cost. If you have something that's infinitely reproducible, why are people paying
Yep.
hundreds of thousands of dollars for it. And so wanted to kind of collect your thoughts on that. Maybe there's a technology underlying there that you and Art may think is going to produce big results down the road, but it's just in its infant stages right now.
Yeah, NFTs are interesting. So for those not aware, NFT stands for non-fungible token, and what's being done where the pricing is going through the roof. Think of it essentially as digital art. And imagine if you just have a little icon or whatever. In some instances, people are paying thousands, if not millions of dollars for these small pieces of digital art that looks like a 10-year-old could have made it. Why is that happening? So Dax, you talked about, well, couldn't someone replace that? The short answer is yes, you could copy and paste it, you could PDF it. But ironically, the reason NFTs are growing is actually due to scarcity. So NFTs really, in most instances, not all, can only be bought using cryptocurrencies such as Ether or Ethereum. And in doing so, basically what happens is if you buy that one NFT, and usually it is a one of one, there is basically a proof on the blockchain that shows you are the one and only owner of that particular NFT. So if you've ever collected arts, baseball cards, all those kind of things, even in your younger years, you might remember the term certificate of authenticity. This essentially becomes the de facto certificate of authenticity in the digital world. And so that's where this sort of scarcity value is coming. And to your point, Dax, it's been such a crazy market. There's a company called OpenSea that's almost like the eBay of NFTs right now. They are doing something like 3 billion of trading volume per month, which is something like 50 million in revenues for that company every month. So it's growing pretty quickly.
It's a brave new world.
Yes, it is. So Dennis, I can actually answer two of your questions on both a bad idea and talking about fintech, because those two are sort of joined at the hip in terms of one of the notable, what we call bad ideas. And what we mean by, I'll make sure we've got about 10 minutes, so be mindful of time. What we mean by bad ideas, jokingly, is industries or companies that are most ripe for being disrupted. And so one of the industries we think most ripe for being disrupted would be the traditional brick and mortar banks. So now we're going to talk about financial services. What do we think the disruption is? We think they're going to be disrupted by what's called digital wallets. What's a digital wallet? It's basically a bank branch that you can access on your cell phone and you can basically get access to financial services at a much cheaper rate than say a traditional brick and mortar bank. A couple of the notable players in this space would be PayPal's Venmo and Cash App from Square. I kind of teased that this is one of the innovations whose growth was definitely accelerated by the pandemic. Here's why. You go back to last year, there were a lot of people who were concerned about transmission. Therefore, they didn't want to use physical cash. They didn't want to use physical and debit cards and credit cards. And therefore, these digital wallets sort of fit an unmet need. And in almost overnight fashion, you've got these companies like Venmo and Cash App now have something like 60 million customers. It took JP Morgan 30 years to get 60 million customers. And these digital wallets have done it in a handful of years. Two other things why these companies are growing so fast, and then we can open up to questions. Number one, their customer acquisition cost. In other words, what it costs to go out and get a new customer is just so much lower than it is relative to a traditional bank. If you think about a traditional bank, it costs more to go out and get a new customer because they have to build out physical infrastructure. They actually have to build out a physical branch. With the digital wallet, all you need is one of these, and it's not like PayPal is manufacturing the phones. So for a traditional bank, it may cost anywhere between $300 to $1,500 to get a new customer. The digital wallets, it only costs like $20. Last but not least, these digital wallets companies have just done a masterful job of digital marketing and creative marketing in general. Cash App does something that's called Cash App Fridays. And what they'll basically do is they will give away money every Friday on Twitter. All you got to do to enter this contest is post your Cash App tag on Twitter. Well, in order to post your tag, you need to get a new Cash App account. So just some really creative marketing that's created a nice halo effect.
So this is a modern day version of banks giving away toasters for new accounts.
I guess so. I heard, so true story. And I heard at one time they'd actually given away Bitcoin. I think back when Bitcoin was $10,000. But yeah, pretty good corollary.
Well, so we have shared with our clients over the years a lot of stories of traditional old line companies getting disrupted with the changes in this techno-industrial revolution. And many of them are well aware of the trends, but they just can't get out of the way of the disruption. So let me ask you the $64,000, I don't know, these days it's a $64 trillion question. The banks, you know, a lot of our clients have old legacy positions in some venerable banks who have been saying they're getting into this space. They're buying up fintech companies. They're hiring some of the best people from the fintech companies. They're doing other things.
Yep.
Are you skeptical that they're going to be able to do the pivot?
Sort of, yes. So two things. Number one, when we talk about companies being disrupted, and the old line banks would be a great example, we don't mean they're going to go belly up. We just think that they're going to lose market share relative to someone else. You know, these emerging companies are going to take market share and grow quicker. But to your point, these big banks do see the writing on the wall. They know this is going on. And so one of the companies that the big banks have partnered up with is a company called Zelle. So Zelle is basically enabling a digital wallet functionality for companies like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, JP Morgan. And Zelle does have something like 80-something million customers, but it's spread across 7,000 different financial institutions. And so, you know, it begs the question of why has it not been as successful? I think number one, the traditional banks, just by their very nature, are more conservative. They're just a little bit slower to move. And number two, in order to, let's say, you know, you want to get a Zelle Wells Fargo account or whatever. In order to get a Zelle account at Wells Fargo, you need to be in the Wells Fargo ecosystem. Well, there are a lot of customers that just can't afford the fees. They don't want to pay the fees. And they're what we call the underbanked or unbanked. And that's millions and millions of customers. And that's another target market that the big banks are missing that these digital wallets are going after. So that's another reason why we think these other companies are going to grow a little bit faster.
Okay. And yet another disclaimer that that and some of the other companies mentioned are not stock recommendations, just examples of some of the trends that are going on.
That's exactly right.
All right. What are a few of the other bad ideas? If anybody out there, by the way, has a question, please put it in the Q&A area of the Zoom chat. So what are some of the other bad things bad areas that could get highly disrupted in this coming 5 to 10 years?
Sure. So we talked about financials. You know, the other one I sort of, well, I talked about already, but it would be the traditional auto manufacturers as well as the energy industry basically being disrupted by A, electric vehicles, which we already talked about, but B, autonomous ride hailing, autonomous taxis. You know, that's the one innovation every time I talk about it, that sounds the most far-fetched. But I can tell you, this is an instance where science fiction has already become science fact. There's a company called Waymo that's been piloting an autonomous taxi out in Phoenix, and they've already logged 30 million miles. So we're already almost there. This is another innovation that has everything to do with falling cost curves. To do the speed version of the timeline, if you look at like cost per mile, back in the 1870s, if you had a horse and buggy, and yes, we're talking about horse and buggies on the innovation webinar, the cost per mile was like $1.70. Fast forward to the 1930s, when you had the advent of the internal combustion engine, things dropped to 70 cents. So a precipitous drop, but it's flatlined all the way to the present. So the costs haven't fallen since then. Not that there haven't been changes in the auto industry, but there's not been a lot of innovation until now. ARC thinks that the cost per mile of autonomous taxis could go down to 25 cents. How do we get that low? Well, particularly in urban areas, you don't have to pay to park. B, I'll allow the Ubers and Lyfts. You don't have to pay a human. And number 3, and this is the one that really gets a lot of people, it's going to be safer. We are more distracted than we've ever been in our lives, right? We're in our car, texts are coming at us, Facebook messages are coming at us. It's dangerous. 35 to 40,000 people per year die in auto accidents, and 90% of them are due to human error. An autonomous vehicle powered by, again, deep learning artificial intelligence is not going to be distracted by that. And so because the safety factor is going up, speaking of another bad idea, ARC also thinks that auto insurance rates are going to come down by half in the next 10 years. So it disrupts the auto industry, it disrupts the oil industry, and potentially the insurance industry.
So are we going to be able to retrain all those New York taxi cab drivers who spent $1 million for their medallion?
Well, and you think about it, Uber and Lyft disrupted that business. Right. And so it's kind of an evolution of that trend that's already started.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's another issue of the whole retraining. Now, we do have a question here about the new Bank of International Settlements. Who will that be in a cryptocurrency world?
There will be no one, and that is sort of the point of cryptocurrency. And Bitcoin is the one we think is ultimately going to be the long-term winner, kind of in a winner-take-most market. It is complete. It's completely decentralized. It is basically run by the network. The network itself, its job is to constantly validate transactions, make sure there are no malefactors, if you will, but there will be no centralized government controlling it, driving it, and that's why it's such a disruptive innovation.
Yeah, so everybody needs to this weekend pull out one of their old copies of or go on Netflix and get Matrix and rewatch those series. Yeah, it's
the metaverse.
Yeah, the metaverse. And that's another interesting question we get occasionally from folks, because they're starting to hear that term more frequently, but a lot of them have no clue what it actually means, other than maybe some gamers getting together.
Yeah, and the rumor has it Facebook is going to change its name next week, and it's going to be tied to something related to the metaverse. But the concept of the metaverse is that we are going to have these digital existences. And it's going to be another convergence where, you're right, Dennis, some of it will be gaming. Some of it, Dax, will be NFTs. People are going to have these virtual rooms where they're going to put up their NFT artwork in a virtual world. So there are a lot of video game backbone companies, I think, that might be interesting here, social media, but it's going to be a convergence of the digital world. And it's sort of what they call Web 3.0.
Web 3.0. I'm not sure some of our clients aren't still struggling with Web 2.0, but okay, that's fun and exciting stuff. Greg, before we wrap up here, anything you want to add?
No, Dennis, the only thing I'd add is, obviously you've got one, thank you for having us on and inviting us. We continue to put out a ton of great research. So I would just tell all of your clients, if they're interested in reading our blogs or our podcast, please reach out to yourself or Dax, and I'm sure you can point them in the right direction, because we do put out a lot of really good information for people that are passionate about innovation and want to learn about the space.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again, Ryan and Greg. Obviously, we've only scratched the surface on a lot of these different areas, so we'll actually maybe look forward to having you back on a future series. Thank you, Dax, for being part of this. Reminder to our audience again, these were not stock recommendations, and do cryptocurrency at your own risk. And this entire session has been recorded, will be available within a day or two on our YouTube channel, and look forward to hearing what other topics all of you would like to hear in the future. And with that, have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.